In 1976, millions of people suddenly became convinced that human beings, weren't the pinnacle of biological evolution.
Right, the narrative shifted completely.
Yeah, they started believing we were essentially genetically engineered mining equipment, built to extract gold for this exhausted race of alien managers.
And the most compelling part of this theory for those millions of readers wasn't like some blurry photo of a UFO.
No, exactly. It was the fact that the proof for this wild alternate history was supposedly sitting right in plain sight, carved into these ancient clay tablets housed in the British Museum.
Which is just, I mean, it represents one of the most profound modern reinterpretations of ancient history. Because when you look at the oldest recorded myths we have from ancient Mesopotamia, you don't find a universe waiting empty for humanity to arrive.
Right, it's not a blank slate at all.
No, you find a cosmos that was already bustling, highly bureaucratized, and just kind of buckling under the weight of its own maintenance. And the entities responsible for managing that exhausted universe were a group of deities known as the Anunnaki.
The Anunnaki. And that is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. We are going to uncover the true story of these beings for you.
We really need to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, we are going to examine the original texts that detail how they created us, who they actually were within the ancient Mesopotamian belief system, and, how their spectacular reign over the cosmos eventually ended.
And their reign ended in a highly unusual way, right?
Oh, totally. First, they just sort of faded away into the subterranean dirt of the ancient Near East thousands of years ago. And then, through this bizarre series of modern translations and fringe theories, they were resurrected.
Resurrected as a spacefaring species in a 20th century narrative. One that, honestly, continues to heavily influence internet culture today.
It's everywhere. But to navigate a shift that massive from ancient Sumerian theology to modern extraterrestrial narratives, we have to anchor ourselves in the actual historical bedrock.
Absolutely. So for you listening, we are utilizing academic translations of foundational Mesopotamian texts, specifically the Epic of Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish.
Classic texts.
Right. And we are also drawing on historical analyses of the shifting Sumerian and Babylonian pantheons, alongside cultural studies that really deconstruct how modern epistemologies interpret those ancient records. Specifically, the highly influential writings of Zecharia Sitchin.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you search for the Anunnaki online today, you basically bypass the ancient theology entirely.
You don't see the clay tablets first.
No, you immediately hit claims like the one made by the Iraqi transport minister back in 2016. I mean, he stood in front of reporters and stated, just as a matter of fact, that ancient Sumerians had constructed spaceports 7,000 years ago.
Which represents a massive departure from the consensus of Assyriology.
Just a bit of a departure, yeah. And he claimed they were actively navigating the solar system.
Right. And to understand the mechanics of how a belief system evolves to a point where public officials are citing ancient spaceports, we first have to reconstruct the reality of who the Mesopotamians themselves believed the Anunnaki to be.
We have to look at the original clay before we look at the modern interpretations. So let's start at that foundational layer. What does the word Anunnaki actually mean?
Well, the term itself, whether it's written as Anunna or Anunnaki, originates in the Sumerian language. And it translates roughly to princely offspring, or offspring of princes.
Offspring of princes, so it's basically a royal title.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It is a designation of supreme divine royalty. They are the direct descendants of the primordial deities, specifically Anon, who functioned as the god of the heavens, and Krihe, who was the goddess of the earth.
Okay, wait, I'm looking at those names. Anunna sounds like it must be a direct linguistic derivative of En, the sky god. I mean, it seems like the etymology is just a combination of his name and a suffix.
You know, it is a really logical assumption, but scholars actually emphasize there is no direct etymological relation to the sky deity En, despite the phonetic similarity.
Really? That's surprising.
Yeah, the name functions purely as a collective title for this specific group. It designates them as the elite royal progeny of the divine realm. They were, without a doubt, the highest tier of authority in the universe.
And their physical manifestation is fascinating, too, because modern religious frameworks condition us to think of the divine as this ethereal, invisible spirit, right? Like an omnipresent energy.
Exactly, a sort of formless presence.
But the Mesopotamian conceptualization of the Anunnaki was overwhelmingly physical.
Extremely so. The deities in ancient Mesopotamia were almost exclusively anthropomorphic. They were envisioned as looking like human beings, but operating on a scale of tremendous, overwhelming physical size.
Like giants.
Right. However, the most defining characteristic of their physical presence wasn't merely their proportions. It was this concept known as melam.
Melem. Now, the translations I read described it as a terrifying splendor, but that phrase feels almost, I don't know, too poetic. What was the actual physical mechanic of Melem?
It's a great question. Because it's less of a gentle glow and much more of an oppressive physical force, melam was this radiant, ambiguous substance that covered them like an atmospheric cloak.
So it's like a visible aura of raw power.
Exactly. And the effect that a deity's melam had upon a human observer was categorized by another specific Sumerian word. That word is nai.
Ni. And what exactly does that entail?
Ni is defined literally as the physical tingling of the flesh.
Yeah.
It is the visceral, autonomic nervous system response to being in the presence of something just incomprehensibly powerful.
Oh, wow. I want to linger on that concept of nigh for a second because, modern religion often focuses on love or grace or an internal peace when interacting with the divine.
Yeah, comforting feeling.
But here, the baseline interaction is involuntary physical terror. It's the hairs on your arms standing up.
Because your nervous system recognizes that you are in the proximity of an apex predator of the cosmos.
Yes. That completely recontextualizes how a Sumerian citizen would have felt merely walking past a temple precinct.
It underscores the absolute power dynamic. You did not approach these beings with casual familiarity. And their visual presentation really reinforced that terror.
How so? What did they look like?
Well, they were depicted wearing highly elaborate horned caps. And these weren't just simple helmets. They featured up to 7 superimposed pairs of ox horns stacked vertically, signifying their supreme status.
7 pairs of horns. That is an intense look.
Very intense. And they wore garments heavily encrusted with intricate gold and silver ornaments that were sewn directly into the fabric. The visual impact would have been dazzling and, frankly, deeply intimidating.
And they were deeply embedded in the civic infrastructure too, right? They didn't just recline on a cloud detached from the mundane world. They required constant, intensive management by the human population.
Well, absolutely. They functioned as the supreme landlords of the city-states. In the early Sumerian texts, particularly during the post-Akkadian or Third period, stretching toward the late 3rd millennium BCE, they are the highest heavenly gods.
But they're local, aren't they?
Exactly. They are intrinsically tied to specific geographical locations. A worshiper wouldn't just pray to a generalized concept of the Anunnaki. The theology was hyper-localized. You might make offerings specifically to, say, the 50 Anunnaki of the city of Eridu.
So they operated almost like a regional board of directors for the cosmos.
And their presence was literal. They resided in temples, which the Mesopotamians viewed as the actual physical houses of the gods. Inside these massive temple complexes sat the cult statues.
And those statues were a big deal.
A huge deal. It is vital to understand that to the ancient Mesopotamians, the statue was not a symbolic representation. Through complex rituals, the statue literally became the physical embodiment of the deity on earth. And an embodied deity requires immense upkeep.
Which means the priests are functioning less like modern clergy and more like, I don't know, a high-level hospitality staff.
That's a perfect way to put it. The logistics were staggering. The priests had to physically feed these statues daily with lavish feasts of meat, bread, and beer.
Every single day.
Every day. They had to wash them, clothe them in those elaborate garments we talked about, and entertain them with music.
I read they even had vehicles for them.
They did. The temples housed massive, full-size barges stored within the precincts, so the statues could be transported along the canal systems for regional festivals.
That is wild.
And they had dedicated chariots for overland travel. In some instances, the cult statue would actually be carted out to a battlefield so the deity could physically watch the military conflict unfold. The idea was they could theoretically influence the outcome.
The sheer economic output required to maintain that illusion is staggering. The temple economy wasn't just a side project. It must have been the central engine driving agricultural production just to ensure that God's pantries were fully stocked.
It absolutely was the center of their economy.
But what I find most compelling is that this localized high-maintenance theology doesn't remain static. The Anunnaki do not hold on to their position in the cosmic C-suite forever.
No, they certainly do not.
As we move down the timeline, their job description undergoes a severe transformation.
We see a profound theological shift as we enter the Middle Babylonian period, which spans roughly 1500 to 1100 BCE. The Anunnaki transition from being the ultimate glorious sky gods who decree the fates of humanity,
To what?
to functioning primarily as phonic deities. Chthonic, referring to deities associated with the underworld and the realm of the dead.
That feels like a brutal corporate restructuring. You have the Anunnaki, the founders of the company, occupying the penthouse of the heavens. But as new management comes in, the old guard gets systematically demoted.
Stripped of their sky privileges, essentially.
Right. They are relocated to the basement, literally the underworld. They transition from the magnificent creators of the universe to the terrifying judges waiting to process your soul in the dirt.
And not only is it akin to a corporate restructuring, but it actually involved physical asset reallocation within the culture. The hierarchy of the ancient polytheistic gods directly mirrored the political realities of the human cities below.
So the mythology was basically just politics.
Precisely. The theology was a reflection of geopolitics. As ancient Sumerian cities fell and new empires rose to power, the narrative had to adapt to legitimize the conquerors.
Makes sense.
When the city of Babylon emerged as the dominant superpower in the region under leaders like Hammurabi, it was politically necessary for Babylon's patron god, Marduk, to be elevated to the position of supreme deity.
Right. The new political CEO requires his own patron god to hold the title of chairman of the board. But you can't just erase the Anunnaki. They are woven into the cultural fabric. The citizens know who they are.
You cannot delete them, so you reassign them. Marduk takes dominion over the heavens, and the Anunnaki are pushed downward. They become the administrators of the subterranean realm.
A massive demotion.
Yes, by the time the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh is solidified, the Anunnaki are explicitly categorized as the 7 judges of the underworld.
Imagine living through a few generations where that theological shift takes hold. The bright, terrifying sky gods that your ancestors built massive ziggurats for are now the dark, subterranean bureaucrats waiting for you in the afterlife.
It's quite the paradigm shift for the average person.
It really is. It reveals how incredibly flexible their belief system was. It had to bend to accommodate the brutal reality of empires rising, falling, and rewriting history to justify their dominance.
That adaptability is a hallmark of ancient polytheism. And it is the exact mechanism that allowed the Anunnaki to survive as a concept for millennia. But to truly comprehend their significance before that demotion, we need to examine their role as creators.
Let's do it.
We have to look at the Mesopotamian origin story of humanity because it stands in stark contrast to the narratives most of the modern world is familiar with today.
This brings us to the Mesopotamian story of creation. If the Anunnaki were the supreme rulers at the beginning of time, how did human beings enter the picture?
That is the big question.
Right. And the text that outlines this, the Epic of Atrahasis, it reads less like a grand spiritual awakening and more like the minutes of a disastrous labor dispute.
It really does. To set the context, we look at the universe prior to human existence, as recorded in the Epic of Atrahasis, which dates back to the 17th century BCE.
So very old.
Very. And the universe was maintained not by humans, but by a subordinate class of gods known as the Igigi.
Igigi, yes.
Yes, the Igigi functioned as the junior deities, and they were tasked with executing all the grueling, backbreaking manual labor required to maintain the cosmic order for the senior Anunnaki gods.
Now, when we talk about manual labor for deities, what are the actual mechanics of that? Are they tending like cosmic gardens in the clouds?
No, it was incredibly literal, heavy corvée labor. According to the texts, the Igigi were responsible for digging the riverbeds. They literally excavated the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers.
Wait, literally digging canals? Like with shovels?
Exactly. They maintained the vast irrigation canals necessary for agriculture. They did the physical farming and the heavy lifting required to keep the world functioning and to keep the Anunnaki temples supplied with those immense resources we discussed earlier.
That sounds exhausting.
It was. The text explicitly states that the workload was heavy, the misery was too much, and after 40 years of this endless toil, the Igigi finally reached a breaking point.
The junior gods unionize. They literally go on strike against the ruling class.
It is the first recorded mythological labor strike. The Igigi set fire to their tools, they burn their spades in their baskets. They march on the great temple of Enlil, who serves as the chief executive of the Anunnaki and the primary enforcer of this labor system.
And what do?
They surround his sanctuary in the middle of the night. They demand immediate relief. They flatly refuse to continue the physical maintenance of the earth.
It is such a profoundly pragmatic view of the universe. The cosmos isn't threatened by a great evil or some demonic force. It's threatened by a walkout over unfair labor practices.
The whole system is just grinding to a halt.
Because the workers have dropped their shovels. Enlil is terrified, the ruling class is barricaded in their temple, and they desperately need a solution to keep the rivers flowing.
The crisis prompts the intervention of Enki. Now, Enki is the god of freshwater, the subterranean aquifer. But his primary attribute is his profound wisdom and his ability to devise clever solutions to intractable problems.
So he's the problem solver of the group?
Exactly. Enki addresses the assembly of the Anunnaki and proposes a radical plan to relieve the Igigi of their labor. He suggests the creation of a brand new entity, a creature called mankind, to bear the yoke of the gods.
A brilliant pivot.
But the manufacturing of this new creature requires specific raw materials, and the acquisition of those materials necessitates a divine sacrifice.
And the ensuing process is visceral. But reading the analysis from our sources, specifically the research by scholars examining this text, reveals a crucial nuance that completely shifts how we should interpret this sacrifice.
That's right. The assembly selects a god named We'ila to be the sacrifice. In the narrative of the Atrahasis, We'ila is identified as the leader of the Igigi strike. He's the instigator of the rebellion.
The ringleader.
Yes. His flesh and blood are to be mixed with clay, and from this biological and earthen amalgam, the mother goddess Nintu will mold the first human beings.
See, modern sensibilities immediately interpret that as a punitive measure. We hear that the leader of a workers' rebellion is executed, and his blood is used to manufacture a subservient race, and our brains scream, vengeance, a brutal warning to the lower classes.
It sounds like an execution.
It really does. But the Mesopotamian text does not frame We'ila's death as an execution, does it?
It does not, and that is a vital distinction for understanding their theology. In the Atrahasis, the sacrifice of We'ila is portrayed as a non-aggressive, highly ritualized, and almost honorable process.
Not a punishment at all.
Explicitly not a punishment. The text notes that We'ila was selected specifically because he possesses a quality called timu, which translates to intelligence, planning, or rationality. He had the cognitive spark to envision a different world and organize the strike.
He possessed the strategic architecture of a leader.
And the Anunnaki desired to transfer that specific divine cognitive architecture into humanity. They needed their new workers to be capable of complex tasks, like agriculture and canal management.
Oh, I see. It was basically a transfer of technology.
Exactly. The ritual involves a purification bath for the gods. We'ila is informed of his role. His death is framed as a necessary divine solution to a cosmic structural failure.
Wow.
The blood provides the divine spirit or ghost that animates the creature, while the clay grounds the human to the physical earth, making them mortal.
If you look at the mechanics of this creation myth, it perfectly mirrors the modern conceptualization of artificial intelligence or advanced robotics.
That's an interesting parallel.
Right, because in the Abrahamic traditions that dominate modern Western thought, humanity is the pinnacle of creation. We're fashioned out of love, imbued with a soul, and granted dominion over the earth.
We are the main characters.
Exactly. But in the Atrahasis, we are automated farm equipment. We were engineered specifically to relieve the ruling class of their chores. Our highest theological purpose is to ensure the irrigation ditches remain clear so the Anunnaki can rest.
It is a purely utilitarian origin story. Humanity's existence is just a practical solution to a bureaucratic problem.
Which is strangely humbling.
It really is. However, just as the political status of the Anunnaki shifted, the narrative of our creation was also subjected to a political rewrite. A few centuries later, in the late 2nd millennium BCE, the Babylonians produced the Enuma Elish.
And the tone changes, right?
The tone of humanity's origin changes drastically.
So when we look at the transition from We'ila's sacrifice to the Enuma Elish, we are looking at a society that has centralized its power. It's no longer a council of gods trying to negotiate a labor dispute. It's an absolute monarch crushing a rebellion.
That is a highly accurate way to frame the political evolution of the era. The Enuma Elish was not merely a myth shared for entertainment. It was state-sponsored liturgy.
Propaganda, essentially.
Heavily tied to the political dominance of Babylon and its patron god Marduk. In this narrative, the universe is threatened not by a labor strike, but by a massive cosmic war led by the primordial sea goddess Tiamat.
And she represents what? Chaos.
Yes, the forces of chaotic, untamed nature. Marduk, representing order and Babylonian authority, ultimately slaughters Tiamat. He splits her body in half to form the heavens and the
A
earth.
much more violent binary conflict, good versus evil, basically.
Exactly. And the creation of humanity in this version requires a completely different kind of sacrifice. Well, following his victory, Marduk decides to create humanity. But the god sacrificed in the Enuma Elish is not the intelligent planner Wi'ila. It is a deity named Kingu.
Kingu, who was he?
Kingu had served as Tiamat's lead general in the war against Marduk. When the war concludes, Kingu is bound in chains, formally brought before an assembly, found guilty of treason for instigating the conflict, and executed explicitly as a punishment.
The shift in the legal framework there is fascinating. It's a cosmic tribunal.
It is a formal sentencing. His blood is then extracted, and notably, there is no mention of clay in this specific account. And the god Ea uses it to manufacture mankind.
The sociological implications of that rewrite are staggering. Think about it. In the older myth, human beings are the byproduct of a clever solution, imbued with the intelligence of a visionary leader.
Right, a noble origin.
But in the Enuma Elish, human beings are the byproduct of a guilty traitor's blood. We are the biological descendants of treason. That is a massive downgrade for human self-esteem.
But an incredibly effective tool for a centralized state.
Exactly. The theology is actively telling the populace, rebellion against the supreme ruler is a cosmic crime that ends in execution.
It cemented the social order perfectly. The Enuma Elish was recited annually at the massive New Year festival in Babylon, and it was accompanied by a grand procession of Marduk's cult statue.
So everyone had to hear it.
Every year. The message was inescapable. You serve the gods, you serve the king who represents the gods, and you never attempt to disrupt the established order as Kingu did.
Okay, so we've established who the Anunnaki were, these colossal, terrifying entities cloaked in Melem, and we understand our relationship to them. They engineered us to maintain their infrastructure.
Right.
But that raises the ultimate question of their historical trajectory. If they were the supreme creators and managers of the universe, how did their story end? Because clearly nobody is making daily sacrifices of grain and beer to Enlil in modern society.
That is very true.
So how did a pantheon that powerful fade from human memory?
Well, they did not experience a single apocalyptic downfall. The death of a god in human history is rarely a dramatic, sudden event.
It's a slower process.
It is a process of slow theological replacement, mythical banishment, and eventual cultural irrelevance. We've already touched on the beginning of their decline with the rise of Marduk and Babylon.
Right, when they got sent to the underworld.
Exactly. The Enuma Elish doesn't just justify Marduk creating humanity. It justifies Marduk taking possession of the Tablets of Destiny.
The Tablets of Destiny, I read about those in the source material. They sound like the administrative passwords to the universe.
They functioned exactly like that. They were the physical manifestation of supreme authority over the cosmic laws. By possessing them, Marduk asserts absolute dominance over the Anunnaki.
He's the new boss.
The text explicitly describes Marduk assigning 300 of the Anunnaki to guard the heavens and 300 to manage the underworld. He dictates their roles.
The irony is profound. The gods who triggered a cosmic crisis and engineered an entire species just to avoid working are now being assigned mandatory shifts by a younger, stronger deity.
And as the centuries progress, the reputation deteriorates further. If you examine later texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Poem of Era, the Anunnaki are no longer viewed as majestic creators.
What do they become?
They become increasingly antagonistic forces. They are the harsh, uncompromising judges of the underworld who set the land aflame before the catastrophic Great Flood. They represent destruction, judgment, and the terrifying finality of death.
But the true endpoint of their reign comes from outside the borders of Mesopotamia, right? We have to look at the neighboring empires to see how they were finally ushered off the theological stage.
We do. As Mesopotamian culture influenced neighboring regions, we look to the mythologies of the Hurrian and Hittite empires. These flourished in Anatolia during the mid to late 2nd millennium BCE.
And what did they do with the Anunnaki?
Hittite scribes were highly syncretic. They identified their own older generation of deities with the Mesopotamian Anunnaki, and in their sacred texts, this older generation is referred to by a very specific term, the Corwheelers Seams.
Which translates to the former ancient gods.
The former gods. It is a literal categorization of obsolescence. According to Hittite mythology, these former gods had been violently defeated and forced down into the underworld by the younger, current generation of storm gods.
Just locked away.
Permanently locked away in the subterranean depths, ruled over by an underworld goddess named Lowani.
Now, if they are locked in the underworld and officially classified as former gods, how does a human worshiper interact with them? Because the sources describe a ritual that is a far cry from the opulent, gold-encrusted temples we talked about earlier.
It represents a stark, almost shocking contrast to their former glory. Because they were banished to the underworld, the Anunnaki no longer possessed active cults in the upper world.
No more big barges.
No towering ziggurats, no dedicated priesthoods offering them daily feasts, no majestic barge processions. To communicate with these former ancient gods, a Hurrian or Hittite priest would not look to the sky. They would perform a ritual known as a kapi.
A copy. What are the actual mechanics of that ritual?
A kapi was a physical pit dug directly into the earth. The priest would dig this trench to create a literal conduit to the underworld. And to attract the attention of the Anunnaki trapped below, they would ritually slaughter a piglet.
A piglet?
Yes. They would allow the blood to drain directly into the dirt pit. The scent and the blood were meant to draw the starving, forgotten gods up from the depths just enough to hear an incantation or a plea.
I really want to pause and emphasize the magnitude of that decline for you listening. Think about the institutions that govern our world today. Our global financial systems, our massive geopolitical alliances, our major world religions.
They feel incredibly permanent.
Right. They feel like they are woven into the very fabric of reality and will last until the end of time. The Anunnaki went from being the absolute, undisputed creators of the universe, being so majestic that simply looking at them caused your nervous system to misfire in terror.
To what?
To being faded ghosts trapped in the dirt, summoned only when someone threw a slaughtered piglet into a muddy ditch. That is the sociological mechanic of how gods die.
It's a sobering thought.
They aren't defeated by a cosmic supervillain. They die when their cities collapse beneath the sand, their names are localized to the dark, and younger, politically relevant gods quite literally pave over their temples.
It is the ultimate manifestation of cultural obsolescence. By the time monotheistic religions sweep through the Near East centuries later, the Anunnaki are already a distant, faded echo.
Just completely gone.
Their temples are buried beneath layers of archaeological strata, their cuneiform language is entirely forgotten, and they are lost to the people living directly on top of their ancient monuments.
And logically, they should have remained lost. They should have been nothing more than a fascinating footnote for dedicated Assyriologists decoding fractured clay tablets.
But history took a deeply weird turn.
Oh, a very weird turn. In the 1970s, the Anunnaki were dug out of that metaphorical pit, fundamentally rebranded, and blasted into outer space.
This transition marks the exact point where historical reality fractures into modern pseudo-history. The entire modern conception of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial beings traces back to the writings of a single individual, Zecharia Sitchin.
Right. We are moving out of the realm of ancient history and stepping into a 20th century resurrection. In 1976, Sitchin publishes a book called The 12th Planet.
A massively influential book.
Yeah, and he presents an entirely new translation of the Mesopotamian creation myth. He treats the tablets not as allegorical theology, but as literal physical history.
Sitchin presented a comprehensive alternative chronology that claimed to be the true hidden history of the human race. According to his interpretation of Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki were not mythological deities. They were a highly advanced flesh-and-blood alien species.
Aliens from where?
He claimed they originated from a planet called Nibiru. He hypothesized this was an undiscovered celestial body in our own solar system, characterized by a massive elliptical 3,600-year orbit that periodically brought it close to Earth.
Okay, if they possess the technology to navigate in an elliptical orbit like that, why bother coming to Earth at all? What was their motive?
The motive, according to Sitchin, was resource extraction. He posited that Nibiru's atmosphere was undergoing a catastrophic degradation. To stabilize their climate, the Anunnaki required massive quantities of monatomic gold.
Gold, like to shield their planet.
Exactly. They intended to suspend it in their atmosphere as a reflective shield. Thus, roughly 450,000 years ago, an expeditionary force of Anunnaki arrived on Earth.
And where did they set up shop?
Sitchin claimed they established their first outpost in ancient Mesopotamia, specifically mapping it to the historical city of Eridu. And they initiated extensive, grueling mining operations deep in southern Africa.
It's so fascinating how Sitchin mirrors the structure of the ancient myths but swaps out the magic for science fiction. Because just like the Atrahasis text where the junior gods get exhausted by digging canals, Sitchin's alien miners get exhausted by digging for gold.
He maps his extraterrestrial theory directly onto the framework of the Atrahasis labor strike. the lower-class Anunnaki miners rebel against the brutal working conditions in the African gold mines.
So the alien workers unionize.
Essentially, yes.
Hmm.
Facing a mutiny, Enki, whom Sitchin reframes not as a god of freshwater but as a high-ranking alien geneticist, decides to manufacture a subservient worker class to take over the mining operations.
But instead of the mystical mixing of clay and divine blood, what does he do?
Sitchin claims Enki utilized advanced genetic engineering. He took the DNA of the Anunnaki and spliced it with the DNA of a native earthly hominid, specifically Homo erectus.
To artificially accelerate evolution.
Exactly, to create Homo sapiens, modern humans.
So in the Sitchin framework, human beings are literally a genetically engineered slave race. Custom built by alien corporate managers to mine gold to fix a failing planetary atmosphere.
It is a highly creative synthesis.
It is a masterclass in sci-fi world building that uses ancient Mesopotamian theology as its scaffolding. And Sitchin even provides a dramatic, cinematic conclusion to their time on Earth. How does he explain their disappearance from the historical record?
Sitchin claims that after ruling over humanity for millennia as gods, the Anunnaki command structure fractured. Severe ideological tensions arose between the faction led by Enki, who grew protective of his human creations, and the faction led by Enlil.
And Enlil wasn't a fan of us.
No, Enlil viewed humanity as an unnatural, noisy abomination that multiplied too quickly. This political tension allegedly escalated into a devastating conflict, culminating in the Anunnaki sanctioning a literal, tactical nuclear strike on Earth.
Wait, a nuclear strike in the ancient Near East?
Around 2400 BCE, yes. Sitchin claims this nuclear event irradiated the Sinai Peninsula and corresponds directly to the biblical destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah.
That is wild.
Following this catastrophic deployment of weapons of mass destruction, the Anunnaki abandoned their earthly outposts, either fleeing back to Nibiru in their spacecraft or retreating to the shadows to manipulate human history from afar.
It is an incredibly detailed, cohesive narrative. It has corporate intrigue, genetic engineering, and nuclear war. But the most staggering fact is that this wasn't marketed or consumed as science fiction.
Not at all.
Sitchin sold millions of copies. People accepted this as a rigorous, factual account of human origins. How does a narrative that radical achieve that level of mainstream acceptance?
It's a question of presentation.
I mean, I'm looking at a picture of a cuneiform tablet right now, and it's just a dense, impenetrable forest of wedge-shaped indentations. If this language is as complex as historians say, how does Sitchin extract a hyper-specific concept like a multi-stage rocket out of that? It feels like trying to read a blueprint in a bowl of alphabet soup.
This is where we must deeply examine his methodology, because it is the crucial mechanism that allowed the theory to propagate so successfully. Sitchin presented his work with the intense aesthetics of rigorous scholarship.
It looked real.
Exactly. He used extensive citations, referenced verifiable archaeological sites, and heavily utilized complex linguistic arguments that looked highly academic to a layperson. But his translation methodology was fundamentally demonstrably flawed.
How so?
Scholars refer to his technique as a linguistic sleight of hand, specifically a reliance on rebus reading.
Okay, explain the mechanics of a rebus reading versus how cuneiform actually operates, because that is the crux of the deception here.
To understand the flaw, you have to understand the evolution of the script. Cuneiform is not an alphabet like English where a letter represents a single sound. It is a highly complex writing system that evolved over thousands of years.
So it wasn't static.
Far from it. Originally, in the earliest Sumerian iterations, it was highly logographic. This means a single distinct sign represented an entire physical word or concept, often abstracted from a very early, primitive picture of the object.
Like drawing a crude picture of a bowl to mean the word food?
Precisely. However, as the centuries passed and the Akkadians adopted the Sumerian script to write their entirely different language, the system became highly syllabic. Signs began to represent phonetic sounds like the syllable ba or ku.
That sounds confusing.
It gets worse. To complicate matters immensely, by the time the tablets Sitchin was reading were actually carved, the language was a dense mixture of both logograms and syllables.
Oh boy.
Furthermore, scribes used determinatives. These are silent signs placed before or after a word to tell the reader what category of object was being discussed, like a wooden object or a divine name. Many signs had a dozen different alternate readings, depending entirely on the grammatical context of the surrounding sentence.
So it is a fluid, incredibly demanding system that requires a deep understanding of historical grammar to decipher.
It requires years of specialized linguistic training. What Sitchin did was systematically ignore the grammatical rules, the phonetic complements, the determinatives, and the historical evolution of the language.
He just tossed the grammar out the window.
He did. He engaged in a rebus reading. He would isolate a specific cuneiform sign, strip it of its grammatical context, trace it back to its absolute earliest, most primitive pictographic form, and then decide what that ancient wedge shape vaguely looked like to his modern 20th century eyes.
And whatever it looked like to him was the translation.
He would then declare that his visual interpretation was the true, original, hidden meaning of the word.
Give me the most prominent example of that, because the rocket ship translation is the one that really anchored his theory in the public consciousness.
The quintessential example is his treatment of the Sumerian sign Mu, which corresponds to the Akkadian and Hebrew word Shem. In standard academically verified translations across thousands of texts, Shem translates to name, reputation, or monument.
Okay, name or monument.
Consider the biblical narrative of the Tower of Babel. The text states that humans gathered to build a great tower in order to make a name for themselves.
A monument to their own greatness, which angers the divine authority.
Right. Well, Sitchin argued that translating it as name was illogical. Why would an omnipotent God be threatened by human beings simply wanting a good reputation? It's a localized plot hole that Sitchin exploits.
So how does he fix the plot hole?
He then takes the cuneiform sign for Mu, traces it back to its oldest pictographic root, and observes the ancient shape. He points to this wedge grouping and argues clearly this depicts a conical chamber with a narrow section attached to it. It visually resembles a rocket ship.
Oh my goodness.
Therefore, he insists that everywhere the ancient texts use the word name or monument, the true translation is skyborne vehicle or rocket.
He swaps the vocabulary word entirely based on a visual resemblance. Suddenly, the Tower of Babel isn't a stone monument. It's a literal launch pad for an intergalactic vehicle. God isn't threatened by human pride. God is threatened by human aerospace engineering. And if you are a reader in the late 1970s, right after the Apollo missions, your brain is culturally primed to see rockets everywhere.
You are highly susceptible to that imagery.
You look at the little line drawing Sitchin provides in his book, and your brain says, yeah, that triangle looks exactly like an Apollo capsule. But it is purely an anachronistic visual trick. It completely ignores how the people who actually spoke and wrote the language used it in a sentence.
It projects 20th century technological aesthetics onto ancient abstracted shapes. It is the equivalent of looking at the modern English letter A, deciding it looks like a stepladder, and arguing that every sentence containing the letter A is secretly a coded message about hardware stores.
That is a perfect analogy, and historians obviously didn't accept this.
The pushback from actual credentialed Assyriologists has been unrelenting. There are extensive resources, such as the work compiled on sitchiniswrong.com by scholars of ancient Semitic languages, that dismantle his methodology line by line.
They really take it apart.
They issue a standing challenge to Sitchin's followers. Produce one single line of actual, contextual cuneiform text, fully translated with its proper grammar, that mentions Nibiru as a planet inhabited by aliens, or the Anunnaki as physical people traveling in fiery rockets.
And the reality is that text does not exist. There is no hidden Sumerian tablet that says Enki fueled up the spaceship.
It simply is not there in the historical record.
The entire sprawling alien narrative is built on ignoring the structural grammar of the language and playing an anachronistic game of Pictionary with ancient symbols. But what is truly remarkable is that despite the total academic debunking, the concept of the extraterrestrial Anunnaki did not collapse.
It proved incredibly resilient.
It didn't just survive Sitchin, it completely outgrew him. They entered what sociologists call the cultic milieu, which brings us to their status in the modern day.
The cultic milieu is a sociological framework used to describe the deeply interconnected underground network of alternative beliefs. It encompasses conspiracy theories, New Age spirituality, fringe science, and esoteric traditions.
A melting pot of ideas.
Once Sitchin successfully injected the concept of the Anunnaki as aliens into the public consciousness, they ceased to be his exclusive intellectual property. They became foundational lore for this entire subculture, and within that milieu, the ideas mutated rapidly and aggressively.
It functions almost exactly like open source software. Sitchin wrote the base code. He released Alien Anunnaki version 1.0, and once it was out in the wild, various internet communities downloaded the code and started modding the game.
They adapted to their own needs.
They added their own patches, their own expansions, and tailored the Anunnaki to fit their own specific worldview.
A perfect example of how this narrative expands and self-corrects is found in Sitchin's own later work. In 2001, he published a book titled The Lost Book of Enki. Sitchin presented this text not as a typical historical analysis, but as a manuscript trouvé, a found document.
Interesting.
He claimed it was the translated first-hand memoirs of the alien geneticist Enki himself, supposedly dictated directly to a Sumerian scribe named Indubsar and carved onto mythical tablets of pure blue lapis lazuli.
So he basically drops the pretense of analyzing existing museum artifacts and writes a piece of historical fiction, framing it as a newly discovered primary source document.
Yes, but the most significant theological mechanism introduced in the Lost Book of Enki is a new entity called Galzu, designated as the creator of all.
Galzu.
Throughout Sitchin's earlier volumes, the Anunnaki aliens were the highest power in the universe. But in this later work, he introduces a truly divine, supernatural, omnipotent entity that sits vastly above the technologically advanced Anunnaki.
What does Galzu do?
Galzu appears in mystical dream visions to the alien leaders Enki and Enlil, guiding their actions, ensuring that humanity survives the nuclear fallout and the floods, and specifically protecting the biblical patriarch Abraham.
Now, why would Sitchin do that? He spent decades building up these aliens as the ultimate creators of humanity. Why undermine his own science fiction universe by suddenly inserting a traditional supernatural god above the aliens?
It was a highly effective epistemological bridge. By introducing the creator of all, Sitchin made his radical, materialist alien theory completely compatible with mainstream Abrahamic religions.
Oh, wow. That's clever.
A reader could now consume Sitchin's work and believe that the God of the Bible is still the ultimate sovereign God of the universe. And the Anunnaki were simply the advanced technological tools that God utilized to enact his divine plan on Earth.
It removed the friction completely.
Exactly. It allowed people to maintain their traditional theological faith while simultaneously participating in the excitement of ancient astronaut theory.
That is a brilliant narrative pivot. He successfully bridged the gap between Sunday school and ancient aliens, and once that theological friction was removed, the cultic milieu sprinted through the open door.
The floodgates were opened.
The Anunnaki myth shattered into 1,000 different fragmented subtheories. Give us a sense of the sheer diversity of what people are doing with the Anunnaki online today.
The variations are astonishingly diverse. On the darker, more paranoid end of the conspiracy spectrum, you have figures like David Icke.
Oh, I've heard of him.
Icke absorbed Sitchin's Anunnaki framework but added a radical new layer. He claimed the Anunnaki were actually a race of shape-shifting reptilian humanoids.
Reptilians.
According to this narrative, these reptilian Anunnaki interbred with human royalty thousands of years ago, and they continue to secretly control all major global institutions, banks, and governments today as a hidden Babylonian brotherhood.
So in that specific mod of the theory, every time the global economy experiences a crash or a war breaks out, it is directly attributed to the machinations of shape-shifting Sumerian reptilians in the financial sector.
Then you have apocalyptic sects, such as the Zetatok community, who latched onto Sitchin's concept of the rogue planet Nibiru. They integrated Nibiru into impending doomsday scenarios, claiming that the planet's massive gravitational pull during its 3,600-year return would cause catastrophic extinction-level pole shifts on Earth.
So it's used for doomsday prepping, too.
However, the adaptations are not exclusively focused on doom and control. There is a massive, deeply spiritual, New Age component to the Anunnaki mythos as well.
Wait, New Age spirituality, we usually associate that with, like, crystal healing and meditation, not genetically engineering space miners. How do the Anunnaki fit into that framework?
It stems directly from Sitchin's assertion that humans were created using Anunnaki DNA. Various spiritual movements have latched onto this genetic link as a marker of inherent divine potential.
Like it's a superpower.
Precisely.
Oh.
In certain esoteric and black nationalist groups, such as elements of the Nuwaubian movement, possessing Anunnaki DNA is viewed as a source of immense spiritual power, latent cosmic knowledge, and racial superiority.
Fascinating.
Furthermore, in broader online New Age communities, you have practitioners who claim the ability to channel Anunnaki entities, such as the ancient goddess Ninmah, to receive interdimensional spiritual healing and guidance.
So they're meditating to talk to the aliens.
In these circles, the Anunnaki are no longer viewed as physical gold mining aliens. They have been re-etherealized into higher dimensional spirit guides whose transcendent essence lives dormant within our own genetic code, waiting to be activated.
So we have shape-shifting lizard bankers manipulating the economy, apocalyptic doomsday cults tracking a rogue planet, and interdimensional spirit guides dispensing healing energy, all radiating outward from a fundamentally flawed translation of a 1976 paperback book.
It is a remarkable cultural phenomenon.
But the core question remains, how does this material stick so firmly in the human psyche? Why does a rational person watch a 3-hour online video about Anunnaki DNA and walk away saying, yes, this is the true nature of reality?
Scholars analyzing this phenomena frequently point to a concept known as Davidson's veracity mechanisms. This refers to the specific techniques a narrator uses to convince an audience of an extraordinary, unbelievable claim by meticulously anchoring it to mundane, verifiable facts.
How does that work in practice?
If you consume Anunnaki content online, they do not simply tell you a fantastical story about Anki cloning hominids in a lab. They present the fiction alongside hard reality.
Right.
They will show you a high-resolution photograph of a genuine lapis lazuli cylinder seal currently housed in a display case at the British Museum. They will map the alien landing sites to real, verifiable geographical coordinates, like the ruins of Eridu or the physical mountains of Ararat.
They drape the wild speculation in the sober aesthetics of academia. Seeing the physical artifact tricks the brain. The viewer looks at the screen and processes it as, well, the museum is real, the clay tablet physically exists, the ruins are excavated. Therefore, the story they are telling me about the tablet must also be completely real.
It creates a powerful illusion of empirical evidence. Furthermore, the theory achieves immense success because it functions as a grand unified theory of everything.
Elaborate on that for us. How does it unify everything?
The human brain possesses a deep evolutionary craving for order, pattern recognition, and definitive explanations. Sitchin's Anunnaki theory provides a clean, single-point answer for nearly every historical and scientific mystery.
It connects all the dots.
It cleanly explains the missing link in human evolution. It wasn't slow natural selection. It was a geneticist's scalpel. It explains the logistical impossibilities of ancient megalithic architecture. Humans didn't drag those stones. Advanced alien anti-gravity technology did.
And it links the flood myths too, right?
Yes, it explains why disparate cultures across the globe share variations of a great flood myth. And through derivatives like David Icke's reptilian theories, it even explains the seemingly senseless cruelty, inequality, and unfairness of modern global politics.
It offers a single, coherent, all-encompassing answer to the terrifying complexities of human existence. It basically functions as the ultimate psychological comfort blanket.
Even when the answer is terrifying.
Right. Even if the answer provided is shape-shifting alien overlords are farming us for resources, that narrative is somehow deeply less terrifying to certain people than the alternative.
The alternative being chaos.
The alternative being that human history is just random, chaotic, driven by our own deeply flawed nature, and no one is actually in control. If the aliens are pulling the strings, well, at least the universe has a management structure. At least someone is driving the bus.
The reality of history is inherently messy. Grasping the slow, organic evolution of ancient languages, the complex logistical rise and fall of agrarian societies, and the nuanced, politically driven shifts in polytheistic theology over thousands of years requires immense cognitive effort.
It's hard work to study history.
The ancient astronaut theory is a massive, simplified shortcut. It allows an individual to feel completely well-informed about the hidden nature of reality without having to engage with the agonizing complexity of actual historical science.
Let's pull back and look at the sheer scale of the epic journey we've just tracked for you all. We started thousands of years ago in the muddy riverbanks of ancient Mesopotamia.
The very beginning.
The Anunnaki began as the terrifying, glorious sky gods, wearing horned caps and radiating a physical power that caused human flesh to tingle in terror. They were the architects of the cosmos who created humanity out of a bloody labor dispute just so we could dig their irrigation ditches.
A purely practical creation.
Then, as political empires rose and fell, they were structurally demoted. They were cast down from the heavens by the Babylonians and the Hittites, stripped of their glorious temples, and reduced to subterranean ghosts. Ghosts that humans only interacted with by tossing slaughtered piglets into dirt pits.
They faded entirely into the archaeological strata for millennia.
And then, in the 20th century, they were dug up, dusted off, and completely resurrected as gold mining, rocket-flying extraterrestrials who genetically engineered our DNA.
It represents a stunning cyclical process of myth-making. And if we connect this evolution to the broader picture of human sociology, what is most striking is the absolute continuity of human psychology.
We really haven't changed much.
Both the ancient Mesopotamians and the modern internet conspiracy theorists are utilizing the exact same group of deities to process and cope with the exact same fundamental anxieties. The questions driving the myth haven't changed in 5,000 years.
Why are we here?
Why is physical survival so laborious? Why is the world structured the way it is, and who is secretly pulling the levers of power?
The ancient Mesopotamians looked at the brutal, unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the sudden, violent rise of new conquering empires, and the backbreaking, endless labor required just to survive the harvest. And they said, the Anunnaki are responsible for this.
It gave them an answer.
And the modern citizen logs onto the internet, looks at the threat of nuclear proliferation, the dizzying ethical implications of genetic engineering, the overwhelming pace of globalized finance, and massive wealth inequality. And they say, the Anunnaki are responsible for this. We didn't change the gods. We just upgraded their wardrobe from horn caps to spacesuits.
The designated names of the power structures remain the same, but the costumes and the technology attributed to them change to reflect the specific capabilities and the specific terrors of the current era.
Which leaves us with a fascinating and frankly deeply provocative thought to close on. The original Sumerian iteration of the Anunnaki was invented to explain the terrifying, uncontrollable forces of the natural world.
The rivers, the storms, the earth.
The modern Sitchin-inspired iteration of the Anunnaki was invented to explain the terrifying, uncontrollable forces of the space age and the Cold War. Therefore, what will the next inevitable iteration of the Anunnaki look like? Think about the humans of the year 4000 CE.
When they look back at us,
when they unearth our decayed internet archives and find petabytes of data endlessly debating Enki, Nibiru, and genetic splicing, what new, unforeseen anxieties will they project onto the princely offspring of Annunaki? As we push further into the digital age, will the Anunnaki be reimagined as rogue artificial intelligences that coded the very simulation we currently inhabit?
it's highly probable that the myth will adapt again.
Will they be reframed as hyperdimensional quantum entities manipulating the multiverse? Because if this deep dive proves anything, it's that the Anunnaki never actually die. They just wait patiently in the dark for us to reinvent them.
They are a mirror for our own fears.
So keep analyzing the structures around you, keep questioning the historical narratives you were handed, whether they are meticulously carved into a clay tablet, printed in a best-selling paperback, or streaming into your feed on a glowing screen. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.